Lesson 1.8 is a very straightforward, fairly simple lesson. However, it's a very important one because it's the first lesson in which we start to interact with the students over some content. Now, this content with which we're dealing revolves around the question of live, where we live, the verb to live. And I'll talk about this video entirely in English, since some of you are using this the ULET program as an ESL curriculum, English as a second language. But if you're teaching French, Spanish, or some other language, just to apply the same structures I'm about to describe to you to the particular language you're teaching. Now, as I said, the lesson is straightforward. However, toward the end of it, there is an activity called an interrogation sequence that I'd like to explain to you. We're talking about where we live. We're talking about the city in which we live, the country in which we live. We're talking about the environment in which we live, whether it be in the city or in the country, about the kind of home, whether it be in a house or an apartment in which we live. And to practice interaction over this content right here, we're going to do what's called an interrogation sequence. And before I show you and describe to you the interrogation sequence, be aware that within the teacher's lesson plan for this particular lesson, if you open it, you'll see interrogation sequence as one of the activities to be performed. If you'll click on details right next to interrogation sequence, that will take you to a page that lays out in written form everything that I'm about to describe to you. So if you want a second resource to understand this activity, that's the place to go. So this is how it works. The teacher is going to ask two students to stand. And the teacher is going to ask the first, so we'll call them students 1 and 2, is going to ask student 1, ask me, the teacher will say, ask me if I live in the country. We'll say the country or the city. That may take a little bit of work for the student to understand. I find that I have to actually walk behind the students and take their hands sometime and help them to form the gesture so they know what it is I'm trying to get them to say. You may find that necessary too. But in any case, once the idea is across, student number 1 asks the teacher, do you live in the country or in the city? Now, of course, the student number 1, you may have had to cause that student to bow down to get the idea across of the you formal, but the student number is going to be using you formal if your language has such a thing. And the student will say, do you live in the country or in the city? The teacher will respond. You can make it a little more complex by saying where you don't live and where you do live, just to demonstrate negation. Well, I don't live in the city. I live in the country. Now, the teacher will return to student number 1 that same question, but of course now it's going to be you familiar. Do you live in the country or in the city? Well, student number 1 will respond, I live in the country. And then the teacher is going to say, does he live, speaking of student number 2, in the country or in the city? Student number 1 will turn to student number 2 and ask the question, do you live in the country or in the city? And student number 2 will respond accordingly, whatever the answer happens to be. Student number 1 will then give the answer for both of them to the teacher. Because they don't know at this point we, or the first person plural, the conjugation for the first person plural, the student will have to speak about each of them individually, themselves individually. The student number 1 will say, therefore, he lives in the city, I live in the country. And you as a teacher can finish it off by saying, okay, so you live in the city, you live in the country, and you, student number 2, live in the city. And that's one entire circuit. Now, I'll show you how that circuit looks like with actual actors here. However, be aware that you can make this into a game. This entire circuit of all the questions that had to be asked and the responses given can be timed. And you can see which pair of students can do the activity along with you as rapidly as possible. When we get into the second unit, and the students learn the plural conjugations, at that point the same kind of activity can be done but with 5 people, 2 pairs, and I'll describe that to you when we get to unit 2. So in any case, here's what the interrogation sequence looks like with some live actors. Ask me if I live in the country or in the city. Do you live in the country or in the city? I live in the country. I don't live in the city. Do you live in the country or in the city? I live in the country. Hey, you. Do you live in the country or in the city? I don't live in the country. I live in the city. Well, I live in the country. He lives in the city. He doesn't live in the country. Good. So you live in the country. He lives in the city. And I live in the country. So there you see how the interrogation sequence takes place. It's quite simple at this point, just one teacher with the two students, whereas in Unit 2, once we get the plural conjugations, the same activity will take on some more complexity as we have 4 students standing and speaking with the teacher. But in any case, you have the teacher saying, I live in this location, you live in this location. You can throw in a negation here so the students hear that structure as well. He or she doesn't live in this place but lives in this other place. And the purpose of having the teacher summarize the conversation at the end is so that the students can hear all of the conjugations correctly said, all of the personal pronouns correctly used, with the exception of you formal if your language happens to have that particular structure, that particular form. And the questions can range from, let's say, do you live in a house or an apartment? Do you live in the city or in the country? Do you live in this town, which is maybe a town located within your school district? Or do you live in this other place, this other town? Do you live in the United States? Do you live in some other country? And to make sure that the rest of the students who are not actively engaged in that conversation were paying attention, and for the purpose of eliciting oral participation comments from the students, you can ask them about student number 1. Does he live in this place, or does he live in a house or an apartment, or does he live in the city or the country? And the students in the class will raise their hands, and you in an orderly fashion will call on them as they respond to your questions about each of the different members of that conversation. You can ask them about yourself as well. It's a good idea because if you ask about yourself, they have to respond to you using the you formal if your language has that structure. And then you can just turn it around and ask them, how about you? Do you live in such and such a location as well? And they raise their hands and participate orally at that point. I think that's all I have to share with you during lesson 1.8 in preparation for it. So that was pretty quick and painless. I'll see you therefore in lesson 1.9. Adiosito. Ciao. Bye.